Welcome back. In a recent poll by Data for Progress, 69% of voters support the mayor investing in affordable housing by partnering with and providing grants to community land trusts. Here in the Bronx, WeStay Nos Quedamos is actively seeking to establish a community land trust, or CLT, to support community-controlled housing, commercial and retail space, green infrastructure, and more. So what exactly are CLTs? Joining us now to discuss this and more is Jessica Clemente, CEO of WeStay Nos Quedamos. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
Of course. So to start, can you just tell us about WeStay Nos Quedamos and your mission?
Sure. Nos Quedamos is a 28-year-old community-led, driven organization that was responsible for the transformation of Melrose as we know it. And it was all driven and designed by fellow community members. It embodies community planning. It's the epitome of what happens when the community sees its future, envisions it, and can actually put in place mechanisms to transform the space. So what we have is a 35 block that encompasses affordable housing, affordable home ownership, 12 community gardens by way of open space, a 1.6 acre park named after our founder, Yolanda Garcia. And it's been about a fight of environmental justice, about equity, about sustainability, and how we the people are the experts and how we the people can design and determine a sustainable community.
Thank you so much for that, Jessica. So as we mentioned, NQ is part of the New York City Community Land Trust Initiative. What exactly are community land trusts before we delve into more of the, the facts?
The land trust, a community land trust is a way where you split the land and the building on top of the land, and you have it as two separate entities. And what you do by doing that is you're creating ownership for the community, and you're using that as a mechanism to stave off real estate speculation. You're taking the economy out of that dialogue, that process, and really start grounding it in a way to keep generational succession, generational pride and commitment, that it's not just in the land and in the ownership, but what it does, it supports families that like in keeping affordability and permanent affordability, keeping ownership and home ownership. So let's say if it's not in a land trust and you have a home and you sell it, what's to say that the person who purchases that home won't transform it into a space that now disrupts the affordability in the community, creates as of right housing that is market and now starts to price out families in the community, right? Like I think concretely you using those examples through the lens of land trust makes the understanding of a land trust a little bit more understandable, because if you just try to talk about it from a purely transactional standpoint, I think that's where it becomes removed. It's flat to me. How I define it, it's changing the narrative in community around ownership. It's preserving affordability. It's creating the path to create the generational wealth that we want to see. It's also for us in Nos Quedamos, and the way we've been incubating our respective land trusts is looking at resources in the community. It's looking at inactivated spaces. It's looking at how do we look at ownership around communications via broadband and creating a broadband mesh network here in Melrose. It's through utility and looking at solar and solar energy and how we could then be in control and own our own solar energy, so that what we're creating in this community is a self-sufficient, self-sustained community that is resilient. And I think that's really where we start changing the narrative around, how do you build community and continue to sustain? And it's, again, it's building on the legacy of Nos Quedamos, is looking at how we started, how we got here, and how we continue to leverage the tools of planning and land use.
All right, thank you, Jessica, for breaking that down for us. I know a lot of folks, don't often understand how CLTs work and how the community can actually work to make a more equitable community alongside nonprofits such as WeStay Nos Quedamos in the community. So we have an image that we want to share on 3 steps of how CLTs work exactly. Can you help us break that down?
Sure.
And we can show it on screen. Yeah, there it gets. All right.
Mm-hmm. So first off, it's about what are the problems communities are facing and how are we looking to take a tool like community land trust to address and solve those problems. What are the problems? Displacement pressures, lack of job opportunity and prosperity. How are we creating and keeping cycles of entrepreneurship and cooperative movement building within the community so that we're not just, creating jobs, but we're creating jobs that are meaningful, that stay in the community, and therefore the cycle remains within the community. Now you look at the tool of the land trust and you kind of take it into the planning, right? And the land use and how do you now say this tool in creating ownership for the community is more sustainable because the community is invested in keeping permanent affordability, preserving affordability. And so there's not this interest in, hiking up rents or not working with families who, are struggling and can't make ends meet or need that extra support in purchasing their first home and really kind of building up home ownership opportunities. So you go from that stage to then how does it look at the end? Community land trust, I should say, is not a new concept. It is not a new model. It's been practiced and proven for many, many years. I mean, this is a new concept for us now because there's just movement building across the city and creating these emerging land trusts, but each are very different and unique in its own right. And so there's not a one cookie cutter approach to how you could use this tool, which is why I think it's what's so unique and special about it, that you can use this tool to address those specific crisis in your community, which brings equity, right? Which brings balance, which brings that community ownership, that and pride that says, you know what, we need to make sure that we heal, we are activated, and we are able to make the changes necessary to provide for our community to break cycles of poverty. So that could look like many different things. It could look like protecting small businesses. It could look like, really supporting homeowners and creating, safety nets for affordable renters so that there's no displacement pressure. In our respect, we're also looking at it through the lens of environmental justice and social equity. And how are we creating resilient communities around, having the right infrastructure in our community, right? Like we know from COVID that broadband and broadband access is not a luxury, right? Like this is something that is very important and pivotal to not just learning for our children, but to health access through telemedicine. Like it's now really proven to really be a critical, essential utility that we need to really look closer at, not just getting access and building access, but now really looking at how do we own that access and how do we make sure that those who have that access can really create the career paths that need folks like us in it.
Right.
Folks like us are people of color, women, those that have not had these traditional careers open up to them. And similarly with solar and solar energy, community solar, and what does that look and how does that, support families and offsetting the burden of having to cover that utility. And so it's really how we're looking to use a model of community ownership, I would say, and not just get stuck in land trust, but it's community ownership and how we're defining community ownership in our respective communities.
Right. And even during COVID, I, wanted to add also all the garden spaces that have become, closed or not accessible to the community can also be leveraged through a CLT, So, this all sounds like ideal, but what's next? I know that recently Nos Quedamos joined other organizations in rallying for CLTs at City Hall. Can you tell us what took place at this rally and where community land trusts stand on a legislative level?
Yeah. Well, first, the rally was to secure funding, right? So clearly we're all nonprofits. We're all, really struggling to ensure that we hold the line and keeping this funding viable so that we could continue to grow and develop our respective capacities. Because what's next is the community building, it's the community education, it's the organizing, and it's the investment for the community to feel like they have the adequate capacity to be able to lead land trust forward. right? And so it's stewarding in some respects, it's incubating what we're doing with the seed funding that we've received through city council. And what I say by seed funding, it was a nominal amount of funding that was created to establish a CLT learning exchange of 10 organizations, of which Nos Quedamos was one, to learn from other established CLTs nationally and internationally, right? To get kind of lessons learned, to understand how each group is responding to their respective communities' needs and how the land trust kind of forms to address those needs. And then now, once that funding has been completed, we've been continued to get, we got another round of city council funding. And now with COVID, it's in jeopardy, right? Because we need to make sure that the city understands that land trust and the land trust movement is not just a fad. Like, this is a community solution that's community driven, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. If we're really serious about equity and long-term sustainability, then community or groups and the community have already defined what that looks like. And so there needs to be a commitment on part of city council to invest, not fund, but to invest in that, because it's going to take multi-years. And I've said that during the rally today. Funding for CLTs is not, you're not going to establish a CLT firmly in one funding cycle. Right? Like, it can't be, you can't see this work in funding cycles. We have to see this work as multi-year, multi-generational. It's an investment. It's really about creating the path forward by way of funding, but then the next stage is legislation. And how are we creating policies that support community-driven CLTs and mission-driven nonprofit developers in getting access to RFPs in the beginning, and creating the systems and the tools and opportunities so that we can be prepared to respond to RFPs when they come up, and be able to put together a development team that will surely, support and address the needs of the community.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for joining us today and sharing more about community land trusts in our community.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
For folks at home, if you want to find out more about community land trust and the movement to make this happen in our communities, you can visit nosquedamos.org or nyccli.org. We'll be right back here on Open BXRX Tuesday.